And I remember so vividly, I would go sometimes on anti-Israel marches or marches against an act of Israeli militarism. This is going back a long time. And I remember thinking, even though I was young then and a bit stupid and wet behind the ears, even then I remember thinking, these demonstrations feel really different to the other ones. They feel a lot more hostile and angry, and they're not just calling for an end to a war, they're calling for an end to an entire country. So even though I might have been just 18 or 19 or 20 and not the brightest spark in the world, they made me feel uncomfortable. And so very early on, I remember thinking there's something fishy about this. There's something off about anti-Israel sentiment, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable. I think we've got to ditch the apologetics and just be much more morally forceful in saying Israel is fighting a just war. The IDF is a heroic fighting force. It is defending not only the Jewish state, but the West more broadly from some of the worst forms of radical Islam on earth. And the Jewish state has a lot to teach us.
Okay, we're joined by a very special guest today, Brendan O'Neill. He's been on JTV a few times, and he's one of the most poignant writers, authors, journalists when it comes to talking about current affairs, particularly with regard to the war in the Middle East, geopolitics, and also understanding the cultural reaction to all these things that we're seeing. Brendan, you recently have come out with a new book called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilisation. And you're really focusing in your new book about not so much what happened on October 7th, but the reaction and what's happened in the aftermath, and almost basically the immediate aftermath that we saw really on the same day. And that's what I want to be the main subject of our discussions today. The first thing I want to start off with is the title of your book. You chose to describe what Hamas did as a pogrom, and I think that's particularly significant because pogroms have existed for hundreds of years in terms of these anti-Semitic rampages, violent escapades among that have been about persecuting, killing, mutilating, raping, kidnapping Jews. And that word is particularly poignant when so many people are attempting to dress up what happened as resistance. So do you want to just talk about the importance of using that word and why you chose that in your title?
Yeah, well, that's basically why I chose it, because I wanted to locate that barbarism within the history of anti-Jewish persecution and take it out of the realm of normal geopolitics or resistance, as the left was referring to it. You know, this fantasy that it was an act of national liberation or an act of guerrilla struggle or however else people were interpreting it. And it wasn't only the crazy radical left who were saying that. You know, even in the mainstream media, there was an understanding at some level that this was an act that was either provoked by Israel or it was an act of war or Hamas was basically getting its revenge. It was continually misrepresented as a normal political military act. And I found that really quite sickening, actually. And I wanted to say quite forcefully on the very front cover of my book that this actually has far more in common with the pogroms of history than it does with anything that takes place in normal geopolitical life. It is, and I thought it was a fascistic act. It was the worst mass murder of Jews in a single day than at any other time since the Holocaust. It was virulently racist, in my view. It was driven by Jew hatred, not just by hostility towards the Jewish state, but by hostility towards Jewish people. And of course, it involved the rape, kidnap, and murder of Jewish men, women, and children. So it was very important for me, right on the cover of the book, to say, look, we need to understand what this event represented. And it was a modern day pogrom. And as you say, the book then delves into the really shocking reality that people went on to the streets of Western cities and celebrated that pogrom.
Absolutely. And I think really this point cuts to the core of the conflict, doesn't it? Because people try to paint the Palestinian cause as being primarily based on some kind of legitimate grievance, and it's all about something, you know, like Israel's original sin that they did something so terrible. But the second you understand that actually this represents something that has existed for thousands of years, and it's about a violent ideological hatred, then it bursts the bubble of that anti-Israel narrative, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This was an attack on the Jewish people and the Jewish nation. It was not an act of war or an act of resistance against Israel. It was an attack on Jews and on the Jewish homeland. It was just completely and utterly an act of anti-Semitic barbarism. So that's really important because, as you say, then we can historicize it properly and we can recognize that this was not a response to anything Israel has done in the time that modern day Israel has existed. It was not a response to anything Israel has done. It was a response to the existence of the Jewish people. It was an attack on the very existence of the Jews in the Middle East and in the world. That's what it represented. And, just think about some of the acts that took place. We know that one of the pogromists phoned home and boasted to his parents about killing 10 Jews with his own hands, and he was very proud of that achievement. We know that women were degraded in the most horrific fashion, and they were raped and then they were murdered, which was an act of racist savagery against women whose only crime is that they were young and Jewish and in the Jewish homeland. This is the reality of what happened. It's an event that could have taken place in 1492 or 1943 or, as we now know, 2023. It's an event that is as old as time, even though it took place in the modern world. And one of the points I make in my book is that it was like the savagery of history leapt off the pages of history books and imprinted itself on our complacent century, because we had believed that things were generally fine and we lived in a nice-ish modern world in which we're all against hate crimes and we all are lovey-dovey, etc. And yet this most wicked of events intruded on that complacency and reminded us that anti-Semitism remains a very real, very violent problem. So it is essential that we understand what Hamas did in the history of Jewish suffering, rather than falsely depicting it as an act that was provoked in some way by Israel.
And your book is very much focused on the way that what happened on October 7th was celebrated or justified, or in some cases denied. I just can't get my head around how people, outside of Hamas, but people, the commentators, the activists in the West, if I was, let's say my grandparents and their generation, they escaped the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, and then if there were a group of Jews who then went into some German town and just indiscriminately grabbed German children and raped German women, mutilated them, kidnapped them, burned, beheaded, I can assure you the Jewish people would have no pride in any of that. They would not celebrate that. I don't even see it happening, but we would not dress it up as any act of resistance. I think it would just be, there would be no justification for that. So I don't understand how we get to a place where there are people who just so, if they acknowledge what actually took place on October 7th, how they're able to just dress it up in that way.
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I mean for me that's the question of my book. Why did people justify this? Why could they not see morally clearly what was happening to the people of southern Israel? What went wrong in their brains and their souls that they couldn't understand what was taking place? I think there's an element where the misinterpretation of this as resistance, as you say, there is absolutely no way that a persecuted people like the Jews in history would then resist by kidnapping kids, raping women, and so on. It just doesn't make sense in any kind of political or logical way. I think there's an element where it was the double racism. I talk in my book about the double racism of modern day leftists and the activist class. And what I mean by that is, firstly, there's the racism of their feverish obsession with Israel, which they hate above all other nations. They have this kind of absolutely bizarre obsession with Israel as a bloodlusting, uniquely murderous nation. And I think that's driven by the racism of Jew hatred. So there's that racism. But then there's also the racism of their low expectations of Arabs, and particularly of Palestinian Arabs, and they infantilize those people. And what they were essentially saying is, well, they couldn't help themselves on 7th of October. They had to react in some way, they had to respond in some fashion. They were just kicking out, they were just lashing out. A real dehumanization, in fact, of those people, and an absolving of them of their responsibility for the wicked, evil acts they carried out on 7th of October. The truth of the matter is that Hamas and other groups consciously planned this event, consciously carried it out, and are entirely responsible for what happened on that day and for what has happened subsequently. But there is this um, desire amongst the activist set to blame Israel for everything because Israel is white in their eyes and therefore it's bad, and to absolve the Palestinians of responsibility for anything because they are brown and that means they're victims. So it's that kind of identitarian narrative and that double racism coming into play, which means that even an act as savage as this was essentially apologized for by people on the left.
It's so stupid as well, given how people actually go to Israel, see how multicolored a society it is. Half of the Jews there from the Arab world, Sephardi background, and then the other half from Ashkenazi, but all have Semitic, inheritance. But I want to talk also about something you touched on in the book, which is and you speak about this a lot, and I saw you talking about this on the Joe Rogan podcast, and you really kind of pushed him to understand this point about the disgraceful moral equivalences that are made between Israel and the Palestinian side. There's a few people that I find are particularly guilty of this. One of them is actually Piers Morgan. Because I noticed that he will speak and he'll say, October 7th, it's disgraceful, it's outrageous what Hamas did. But at the same time, moral equivalence, at the same time, what Israel's doing, and it's so clear that there's a fundamental difference, and it should be nothing to do with death count or numbers, but about intent and who you're targeting. And it should be so clear and straightforward, and yet people like him play, I think, a big role in making so many people think, well, this is really nuanced, and both sides, and I think even Obama used that phrase, both sides have blood on their hands. Can you talk a bit about this and why it's so important that we have moral clarity on this?
Yeah, we urgently need moral clarity on this. There is no, as you know, better than most people, there is no moral equivalence whatsoever between Israel and Hamas. And any suggestion that there is just grotesque, in my view. It's grotesque and it's anti-Semitic to compare the world's only Jewish nation to a bunch of racist terrorists. That's an anti-Semitic thing to do, I think. There's no moral equivalence. And the numbers game, which is a horrible phrase, but it is a phrase people use. The numbers game that people play is just idiotic. It's infantile. It's not based in any sense of reality or any sense of morality or any sense of truth. The war in Gaza is horrible. No one's going to deny that. That's one of the reasons I think it's a just war that Israel has every right to fight. And I still believe it's a noble goal to seek the full destruction of Hamas. I think that's a very important thing for Israel and for the world. But it's a horrible war. All wars are horrible. This is one of the reasons some of us really dislike Hamas, not only because of the horrors it visited on the Jewish people on 7th of October, but also because it started a war that really is not very nice at all. And it's causing a lot of hardship for people across the board. So the war is awful. But the truth of the matter is that people, including civilians, and I think the numbers that we're being told about deaths in Gaza are problematic, shall we say, and the idea that the vast majority of the deaths are women and children simply does not stack up, and there's no evidence for that whatsoever. We're never told about the huge numbers of Hamas terrorists who have been killed, and that is the aim of this war, to finish off Hamas and to get back the hostages. But the truth of the matter is that civilians die in every war. In every war in history, not only do combatants die, but so do civilians, tragically. That's one of the tragedies of war, including women and including children. It's awful, but that's what happens in war. What happened on 7th of October was entirely different. These people who were killed, including women and children, and including grandparents, including the elderly who have nothing, who would never normally be involved in any form of conflict, The reason they were killed, they were consciously targeted on the basis of their nationality, on the basis of their ethnicity, on the basis of their Jewishness, for violent racial persecution and murder. That is the difference. There is a difference between seeking out women and children to murder because you hate their entire race, and the deaths of women and children as a tragic consequence of a bloody war. And anyone who cannot see the moral difference between those two things is just so lost to Israelophobia that I fear there's no hope for them at all. And, it would be like comparing, and people do make this comparison, which is incredibly worrying, but it would be like comparing the Nazis rounding up Jews and sticking them in death camps to the bombings that Allied forces had to carry out on Germany and other parts of Europe in order to liberate Europe from Nazism. There's no moral equivalence between those two things. And any suggestion that there is would really reveal that our moral compass is even more broken than I feared it was.
Well, absolutely. And but the scary thing to me is that it's not just, um, you know, people who are very ill-informed that have these views. It's people in really serious positions. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but last week at the United Nations, where there was Daniel Levy, who was sitting with the Palestinian, commission, and was basically saying that in front of Noah Argamani, and the whole point was she was giving a testimony where she, as a former hostage of Hamas, was telling them what she went through, and he said, "It's very sad what you went through." And if there, we should have a minute's silence for all the people, children killed on October 7th, but also we could have a minute's silence for all those murdered by Israel in the war in Gaza. Again, using that, creating that moral equivalence. To me and to you, the difference seems so obvious.
Oh.
I don't. What do you think it is? Why can't people see it? You think it's down to you just think it's down to age-old Israelophobia, anti-Semitism?
I think that's a large part of it, yes. Because you know what? Listening to you speak there, it just struck me that actually the problem is worse than one of moral equivalence, which would be bad enough. Some of these people, many of them, in fact, the majority of the activist class, they think Israel is far worse than Hamas. They think Israel is
Yeah.
far more immoral and depraved than Hamas. They hate Israel far more than Hamas, and they think Israel is the real evil player, and Hamas is either an innocent victim or potentially even a good thing, a force for resistance. So it's kind of moral equivalence gone off the rails because they actually hold the honourable side, the democratic side, i.e., Israel. They hold them to be more evil and more wicked than the bunch of anti-Semitic terrorists who carried out the pogrom of 7th of October. I mean, it's completely insane, and I do think Israelophobia, which is a form of anti-Semitism, I do think that plays a large part in this, because if you look at the way people talk about Israel, they don't just say, "I'm opposed to Israel's wars," or "I don't like Benjamin Netanyahu," or whatever. People can say that. I don't care. You can criticize any country in the world if you want to, but that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is they're feverishly obsessing over Israel to the exclusion of every other problem on earth. That's the first problem. And secondly, the way they talk about Israel is so creepy. They refer to it, and these are all direct quotes I'm about to say, they refer to it as a uniquely murderous country. They talk about its bloodletting in Gaza. There is an obsession with its focus on murdering children. They're obsessed with the idea that Israel hunts down children and loves to let their blood. I mean, you will see this commentary in mainstream publications as well as on those hate marches as well. Now, if anyone tells me that that doesn't have very serious echoes of what people used to say about the Jews, then I just think they're kidding themselves. Because it seems to me that everything that they used to say about the Jewish people, they now say about the Jewish nation. They used to say the Jewish people were a bloodlusting people. They liked to kill and sacrifice children. They liked to let their blood. They were uniquely problematic. They were controlling of global affairs and the weather and everything else. All those deranged anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are now projected onto the Jewish nation. We're told that it's uniquely murderous. It loves killing children. It loves letting their blood. It is extraordinarily powerful. It puppeteers America. It puppeteers Europe. All the same conspiracy theories have been projected onto Israel. And they can call that anti-Zionism until the cows come home. But those of us who know even a smidgen about history know full well that it smacks entirely of anti-Semitism. So I do think a lot of this moral equivalence stuff, where Israel is actually seen as even more barbaric than Hamas, that is driven by bigotry. It's driven by a racial bigotry that echoes very clearly what's been happening in Europe and elsewhere for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and I will often say to my non-Jewish friends who, let's say, aren't so well informed on the conflict, I just say to them, just there's roughly 220 countries in the world. There's only one country in the world whose very legitimacy and its existence is questioned. And you really want to tell me that has, and it just happens to be the Jewish one? You want to tell me that given that there's been thousands of years of, anti-Semitism, that has nothing to do with that? It's amazing. I saw, and this is a great example of how this Israelophobia can completely blind intelligence. Francesca Albanese, who's the United Nations Special Envoy for Palestinian territories, as it's referred to, and she was being asked about, there's more resolutions at the United Nations against Israel than all other countries combined. She said, what? And they said, what? The interviewer said, why is that? And she said, well, I think it's because nothing ever changes with regard to Israel. I mean, it's unbelievable. But then if so much of this with people who are intelligent is driven by a bigotry, is there any hope that we can change these people's minds through conversation and logic if their own logic is being so clouded? Or are you really trying to win over people in the middle?
That's a really good question. And I have thought about that, because I went on some of those anti Israel demonstrations after 7th of October just to observe them, of course. I'm not taking part in that carnival of hatred, but I went to observe them. And I just
Did you
thought
have
to
to wear a
myself,
disguise?
no, I did get recognized on one of them and just hurried off. Um, I did think to myself, I'm sorry, but these people aren't worth talking to. I couldn't see anyone there who was worth engaging with because, one of the things that people say about these demonstrations, like Owen Jones has said this, and other people on the left, they've said, look, there was only a few instances of anti-Semitism, a tiny minority, stop making a big deal of it. Firstly, I'm sorry, if there was a BNP march at which people were chanting openly for the murder of every black person on earth, do you think Owen Jones would say that? Of course he wouldn't. He'd be
Yeah.
writing columns about it for months on end. But
Yeah.
because it was just a bunch of radical Islamists calling for the murder of all Jews, I heard it with my own ears. I heard them chanting for the return of the army of Muhammad to kill the Jews. Because it was just that, no big deal. Who cares? It doesn't matter. Sickening, grotesque double standards. But, you're absolutely right to say that this obsession with one state is something that we really need to talk about. And when I hear people define themselves as anti-Zionist, they will say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. And I just think to myself, okay, why are you anti-Zionist? Why are you defining your entire political personality in opposition to one form of nationhood against all the others?
Yeah.
The idea that it's any better to be an active vocal anti-Zionist than it is to be an active vocal anti-Semite makes no sense to me. Because if you are defining your entire political trajectory on the basis that you want to see the destruction of the Jewish homeland, then I've got some news for you. You're a racist. And there's no two ways about that. And,
Yeah.
these people don't go on the streets and froth at the mouth about Turkish nationhood or Lithuanian nationalism
Mm.
or Italian nationalism. They don't care about any of that stuff. Many of those nations were born violently too, by the way. Most modern nations were. They were born through struggles against empire or struggles against foreign rulers, etc. But they don't go on the street and go crazy about those things. It's only the Zionist project that boils their piss, if you'll excuse my language, and drives them crazy. And they feel like they have to devote virtually their entire life to destroying this one form of nationhood. That's racist. That
Yeah.
is xenophobia and anti-Semitism combined. And that's all there is to it. And as to whether these people can be reasoned with, I'm kind of slightly dodging your question because I don't know the answer to that. I think most of the committed anti-Zionists probably can't be, and we do have to wait until they come to their senses, if and when that ever happens. I think there are probably people on the periphery of this stuff who could be. And, I encounter people in my everyday life all the time, family members, friends, who will say things like, Israel's going too far, or I saw this thing on the BBC last night and it really made me feel ill. I don't like what Israel's doing. And you can have a reasoned discussion with those people. You can say, firstly, don't trust the BBC on Israel. That's a fool's errand. But also, you can say to them, look, do you think the Jewish state has a right to exist? Do you think that Hamas represents an existential threat to the existence of the Jewish state? Do you think it's right to fight a war for the continued existence of your own homeland? And people can see sense on that. People who haven't been completely brainwashed by anti-Zionism, the racist project of anti-Zionism, they can see sense on that. And I say to one of my brothers is a bit iffy on the Israel question. And I say to him, all right, imagine Ireland, where we originally come from, was subjected to an existential invasion. Don't you think Irish people would have the right to stand up for themselves and to push back and to fight a war in defense of their own homeland? People can come around to that. But I think those who think that Israel is a uniquely murderous nation and that Zionism is a uniquely problematic project, I think they're probably so lost, it's not worth the hassle.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think this whole thing of trying to dress up anti-Semitism is just anti-Zionism. No, no, no. They hide it behind just anti-Zionism. It really cuts to the core of so much of this. I was watching the now removed BBC documentary about surviving a war zone in Gaza, which is now facing, it looks like, terrorism investigations from the police. And I want to talk a bit about that in a moment. But I'm sure you saw this, they mistranslated what
Yeah.
one of these Gazan women said. And it gets to the heart of everything, because she was saying, well, they translated what she was saying as, we are fighting the Israelis and it's about resistance. But the actual words she used was, we're fighting the Jews and it's jihad. And the second you understand that, you realize, no, 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 this is not. And this never was about some kind of Zionist, foreign colonialist entity that they're against. And once they get rid of that, it's fine. It's about age-old ideological Jew hatred. And
Yeah.
the BBC, what they've done here, and also, of course, it was discovered through David Collier, the investigative journalist, that the main narrator of this program they created was the son of a Hamas minister, deeply, deeply embedded in Hamas elites. Do you feel that when it comes to the BBC, and just with this documentary, but also more generally their reporting of Israel, does what they do and their anti-Israel bias, do you think it comes more down to just a foolishness or an ignorance, or is it actually something a lot more sinister and complicit going on here?
I think it's probably a bit of both. And I think if you look at that documentary, the Gaza documentary, what the BBC did there was astonishing, and we can't let this issue go. I know you'll be referred to as a BBC basher or a whinger if you go on about it, but it was simply extraordinary. This was a documentary about the Israel-Gaza conflict, the Israel-Hamas conflict, which, as you say, was fronted by the son of a Hamas minister. So fronted by the son of a man who has links to the movement that carried out the worst mass murder of Jews in a single day than anyone else since the Nazis. That's incredibly serious. It's a documentary in which, as you say, they mistranslated some of the commentary. I wrote about that in The Spectator, and I was just looking at all the mistranslations, and it's really shocking. There are at least 5 instances where people were mistranslated, so that instead of what they really said was, we have to fight against the Jews, or we have to invade the Jews, or launch holy war against the Jews. And the BBC changed it to fight back against Israeli forces. And as you say, such a brilliant illustration of how so-called anti-Zionism is often very, very often just anti-Semitism, almost always, I think. And it was a documentary in which one of the cameramen is on record as having cheered 7th of October and celebrated it on Facebook. And you just think to yourself, this is as crazy and obscene as if we had discovered in the mid-1930s that there were people working for the BBC or around the BBC who had celebrated Crystal Night. who had celebrated the fascistic attacks on Jews or pogroms against the Jews. It's that bad. That's how serious this is. And it's even reached the situation where it's possible that some of the money that the BBC and its production companies gave to this kid, the 14-year-old kid who was one of the chief narrators, it's possible that ended up in Hamas's coffers in some way. So that's how serious this is. The public broadcaster, which we are compelled by law to fund, all of us have to give money to the BBC if we want to own a television. It's possible that money, our money, ended up in some way going towards Hamas as payment for this propagandistic documentary. So the BBC has become a mouthpiece for Hamas. And not just with this documentary, but with its coverage more broadly. Its coverage of Gaza has been beyond awful. And the thing that's really struck me about its coverage over the past year and a half is that it will often show footage from inside Gaza, filmed usually by local journalists or local people. And the BBC's coverage very rarely shows Hamas fighters. It never shows who the IDF. It will often show the IDF firing from a distance or dropping a bomb or whatever else they're doing, but it won't show who they're fighting against. You hardly ever catch a glimpse of a Hamas fighter. And you're left with the impression, if you're an everyday BBC viewer, as millions of people are, you're left with the impression that the IDF is fighting ghosts, that the IDF is fighting no one, in fact, that it's just going into Gaza to murder women and children. It's the most dishonest war coverage I've seen in my life. It is absolute unforgivable propaganda that directly benefits the army of anti-Semites in Hamas. That's how serious the BBC's failings are. And I just think when you have that kind of media coverage, and I'm not one of those people who thinks that ordinary citizens are brainwashed by the media. I think people are much more sensible than that, and they have critical faculties and they can think for themselves. But I do think when you have this constant drip of anti-Israel propaganda from the BBC and others, I think that does have a problematic impact on how the country at large understands this conflict, and that's really worrying.
Do you think they're going to face meaningful consequences this time?
I hope so. I think there's probably a sense of emergency in the BBC over this scandal because they recognise how serious it is. They've already said they are going to pull the documentary, and they failed in their due diligence. The thing that worries me, though, is that their focus on this documentary might distract from the broader problem of their coverage. So I do worry that the BBC might offer up this documentary almost as a kind of sacrifice and say, look, we really messed up with this one. We really screwed up. We didn't do our job properly, and we're so sorry. And everyone will say, yay, the BBC's owned up to its crap documentary. But that will be a way of distracting from the truth that the BBC's coverage across the board on this issue has been atrocious. And I think that's the bigger discussion we need to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Who, other than the BBC, who would you consider to be some of the worst media offenders when it comes to coverage?
Oh, well, they're the obvious ones like Channel 4 News and The Guardian and the so-called liberal press. I mean, they've been awful. And CNN. Sometimes I even forget some of the awful stuff that's been done by the media over the past year and a half. The way they rushed to blame Israel for bombing hospitals that Israel hadn't bombed, or their belief in every statement released by Hamas officials they have instantly believed, whether it's on death tolls or bombings, etc. At some point, someone who's got a lot of time and energy should write a book, I think, documenting the media's misinformation on this conflict and the media's complicity with Hamas's lies. I mean, that would be a really worthwhile project because even I kind of forget some of the really bad stuff that happened over the past year and a half. Yeah, the usual suspects have been awful. The BBC has been the worst. And this is a globally influential media institution. So it's really bad news that they're spreading so much crap. CNN, The Guardian. But, even in some of the media that's been a bit better, like even in, I guess you might refer to it as the more conservative media or however we want to describe it, even there, it's not been ideal. It's not been great. And even their very obsession with this conflict sometimes makes me feel a bit nervous because I want to say to them, can we talk about Sudan? Can we talk about what Turkey is doing in Syria and its crusade against the Kurds. Can we talk about Myanmar? Can we talk about any other conflict just for 5 minutes to give us a bit of respite from your crazy obsession with everything Israel does? So the coverage has felt disproportionate in terms of its time and how much space Israel occupies in the media brain. And it has felt morally warped very often, where we're not being told the truth of what Israel is doing in Gaza. And the truth of what Israel is doing in Gaza, and you're not allowed to say this, but we should say it, is that it is fighting a just and heroic war against an army of anti Semites that threaten not only the existence of the Jewish state, but the free world more broadly.
Mm.
And people's unwillingness to say that or appreciate that, that really worries me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And for you and I and people that care about Israel, the West, all these things, we've known and for a while about the threat of radical Islam, of far left progressivism that can totally twist truth and falsehood in regard to this conflict. But one thing that's emerged, to my surprise, to some extent, over the past couple years, has been the emergence of this kind of right-wing strain of anti-Semitism as well. That whether it's the Candace Owens, the Andrew Tates, a bit of a Tucker Carlson thing. I wondered what your thoughts were on how much of a problem do you think this is? Is this something that's kind of largely going to be, can be sidelined to just, echo chambers on the internet? Or actually, does this represent something that could, maybe manifest into go all the way up into politicians sooner or later as this base kind of grows?
Yeah, it worries me enormously, I have to say. I don't think it's an easily controlled phenomenon. And I've been observing that for some time, and I've written a few things about it, this growth of right-wing anti-Semitism. And of course, there's a long history of right-wing anti-Semitism. Far-right anti-Semitism for a period of time was the main form of anti-Semitism. And then it was kind of supplanted by left-wing anti-Semitism in relatively recent times. Um, yeah, it worries me enormously. And I think it demonstrates the truth about anti Semitism. There is this tendency to see anti Semitism as just another form of racism. And you'll often hear, because the political class and the media elites are so reluctant to talk about anti Semitism, um, when they do have to talk about it, they will often say, of course, I'm against anti Semitism and all other forms of racism. They always add that at the end. They can never just focus exclusively on the problem of Jew hatred. They would see that as giving preference to Jewish people. That's how morally warped these influential sections of society have become. And when you look at Holocaust Memorial Day, which we had fairly recently, virtually every statement from the leaders of the Western world would say, look, the lesson of the Holocaust is that racism is bad and bigotry is bad and we should be nice to everyone, Jewish people and Muslims and trans people, etc., etc. No, that's not the lesson of the Holocaust. The lesson of the Holocaust is that anti-Semitism is a very specific form of derangement, moral derangement, social derangement, which sees the Jews not only as racially inferior, in fact, it sees sometimes as racially superior. It sees the Jews as the source of every ill in the world. It is a swirling, hateful, bigoted conspiracy theory that holds the Jews responsible for every social and moral sickness, and therefore often ends up in the belief that the Jews have to be sorted out, whether that's getting rid of them entirely, depriving them of their homeland, or putting them back in their place in some fashion. So anti Semitism is not just another form of racism. Of course, like you, Ollie, I think all forms of racism are bad. People should not be racist. But anti-Semitism is something very specific and very unique. And that uniqueness, the unique nature of this particular form of conspiratorial and often murderous hatred, is continually played down in the era of identity politics. And anti-Semitism is instead put on a par with all other forms of bigotry, as if it's just another form of bigotry. But what we've seen over the past year and a half proves that it isn't. It is a conspiratorial derangement that actually unites people on the left and the right in this deranged vision that the Jews are a uniquely problematic people. So I think the fact that it's now surging once again amongst right wingers, as well as on the left, where it's been prominent for some time, that's incredibly worrying because it suggests that we haven't successfully dampened down the return of this derangement over the past few years, and it has returned. And the fact that it's spreading like the disease it is incredibly worrying. And I think it really puts the onus on those of us who want to tackle anti-Semitism just to say, listen, we need to get serious about this because it's not going away. And in fact, in some ways, at the moment, it's getting worse.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's why your voice is so incredibly appreciated by the Jewish community, by people who are pro Israel, pro West, pro sanity. Um, Two final questions. First of all, we're so grateful for your articulate expressing of Israel's case, of just basic morality, really, when it comes to these issues. Because there's a lot of people who can have a sense of what's right or wrong, but it's another thing to be able to really articulate that clearly. I'm curious though, you're not Jewish. There's lots, as you were saying before, there's lots of issues that are going on in the world that need to be spoken about. But I'm curious why. I know you do write about many, many issues very, very brilliantly, I must say. But you've just written the book about this, and you do focus on this issue a lot, Israel and anti-Semitism. Why do you think it's so important that you've invested quite a lot of your time into this?
Yeah, it's kind of I've been writing about Israel and the new anti-Semitism for quite a long time, probably about 20 years. And you know, many of your listeners or some of your listeners might know that I come from a left-wing background originally. I was involved in left-wing politics and activism and all sorts of things when I was younger. And that included going on anti-war marches. I marched against the Iraq War. I marched against the bombing of the Serbs. I did all these things that left-wing young people do. And I remember so vividly, I would go sometimes on anti-Israel marches or marches against an act of Israeli militarism. This is going back a long time. And I remember thinking, even though I was young then and a bit stupid and wet behind the ears, even then I remember thinking, these demonstrations feel really different to the other ones. They feel a lot more hostile and angry, and they're not just calling for an end to a war, they're calling for an end to an entire country. So even though I might have been just 18 or 19 or 20 and not the brightest spark in the world, they made me feel uncomfortable. And so very early on, I remember thinking there's something fishy about this. There's something off about anti-Israel sentiment, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable. So I just kind of started thinking about it more and more. So I've been worried about Israelophobia for a long time. And what I discovered when I started writing about it, when I started saying, listen, I think there's something wrong about this. And this hatred for Israel feels unusual and creepy and problematic. Um, I discovered that there was an audience for that kind of argument. There was an audience for people who were willing to call out the feverish obsession with Israel that we see in many parts of the Western world. So I kind of carried on writing about it and carried on pursuing it as an idea. And over the past couple of decades, I guess, I've ended up in a situation where I think I have something to offer on this question. And I think I have some useful insights into the hatred for Israel and the return of anti-Semitism in the West and elsewhere. So yeah, it just became a bit of an issue for me. And as soon as 7th of October happened, I remember thinking to myself, the response to this is going to be really bad. The response in the West is going to be really bad. And it ended up being even worse than I expected it to be. And it dawned on me that I should get my thought, instead of just fuming at people. Like, for example, I remember after 7th of October, I am a cyclist. I cycle around London all the time. I found myself just, when I cycled past an anti-Israel demonstration, which I did very often, big ones and small ones, I just found myself shouting Hamas at these people. I was so angry about everything that was going on that I was riding my bike around screaming at random people in the middle of the street. I thought that's not healthy. So I need to get my thoughts together. I need to document them. I need to do a short book on what I think is going on here. So that was really the impetus there. But as you say, I'm not Jewish. I come from an Irish Roman Catholic background, but I am someone who believes in freedom and reason and truth and the right of people to live safely in their own homelands or anywhere in the world that they want to live. That is those are my core beliefs. And I see anti-Semitism, the poison of anti-Semitism, as right now the most pressing threat to all of those beliefs that I hold dear. So I just think it's incredibly important for me and everyone else to call this sickness out.
Wow, wow, wow. Well, we're extremely grateful for what you've been doing historically and recently as well. My final question to you, Brendan, is as someone that lives outside of Israel but is often commentating on what's happening, a lot of people that you've spoken about point to Israel as a country and society that should be shamed. But actually, I believe, and I'm sure you do, is actually I think we have a lot to learn from Israel as a country, particularly around resilience in all respects. I wondered, just as a final question, what do you think we and the West can learn from in the way that Israel acts and behaves?
I couldn't agree more with what you've just said. I think there's a tendency, even amongst people who would be on our side of this discussion, there has been a tendency, possibly an understandable tendency, over the past year and a half to say, look, Israel has the right to do this. It has to do this. There's an apologism sometimes.
Yeah,
It's not nice. We're really sorry, but we've got to do it. Um, I think we've got to ditch the apologetics and just be much more morally forceful in saying Israel is fighting a just war. The IDF is a heroic fighting force. It is defending not only the Jewish state, but the West more broadly from some of the worst forms of radical Islam on earth. And the Jewish state has a lot to teach us. And in fact, one of the reasons the left in the West hates the Jewish state so much is because they quite rightly see it as embodying all the best things about the West that they hate. So all the things that they have been educated to loathe about Western society, so the claims of Western civilization, the ideas of enlightenment, the ideas of democracy, the quite modern idea of nationhood and protecting your nation from external threats, all these things that we used to value. People in the West used to value and celebrate those ideals. We've now been taught to hate them and to be ashamed of them and to be ashamed of our history, ashamed of our civilization, ashamed of our nation states, and to sell off our borders to the European Union or whoever else it might be. We're encouraged to feel shame towards the gains and the wonders of the Western world. And one of the reasons these people hate Israel and have turned it into the whipping boy of their entire political personality is because they quite rightly see it as embodying many of those virtues, as embodying many of those values. It's a resilient country. It believes in itself. It believes in its democracy. It sees itself as springing from a long Jewish history, but also a Judeo-Christian culture in terms of the rights of nationhood, the rights of protecting one's borders, all of those ideas that have grown in the modern era. It sees itself as embodying those things, and it does embody those things. So we should sing Israel's praises for precisely the same reason that the left in the West hates it, which is that it is a plucky, confident, resilient nation that is willing to fight for its existence against an army that came into its territory on the 7th of October and butchered its people. We should take inspiration from that rather than treating it as something bad.
absolutely. Well, I think that's a great uplifting note to end on. And that really what you said there is the way in a sane world, the world would be acting. But Brendan, thank you so much for making the time as always to feature on JTV. You've featured a few times now, and it's always so appreciative to hear from you, to learn from you. Brendan's book is called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. You can purchase it on Amazon. We've got viewers across the world, so I'm sure there'll be all kinds of people from all different backgrounds taking a look at this. We'll put the link in the video description. Please do get a copy of the book and share it with others as well, because Brendan's voice is really, really important. So all that's left to say is, Brendan, thanks so much again for being here, and thanks for all that you do.
Thanks, Ollie.
Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.